Hey friends, welcome to another episode of What's the Research with your favorite integrated plant-based lifestyle coach, Alyssa Nicole. So today we're going to be talking about cost. So we're going to be talking about reducing cost on food in households. And the research article that we're going to be reading today is called Reduced Red and Processed Meat Consumption is Associated with Lower Diet Costs in the U.S. Households, a National Analysis of Protein Substitutions. So this one is a really good one because I like it because it basically tells you in the title that meat consumption is associated with lower diet costs. So that's always good to hear. But let's examine how. So we're going to look at our objective, and it says to examine the association between red and processed meat consumption and total food expenditures. And they're going to be substituting these meats with other protein sources such as poultry, seafood, eggs, and plant proteins. All right, so let's start off with our introduction. So it says high red and processed meat consumption has been associated with a higher risk of an all-cause mortality and chronic diseases, including the COV and colorectal, stomach, and pancreatic cancers. Conversely, consumption of poultry, fish, nuts, and plant proteins has been associated with lower mortality and chronic disease risk, particularly when they replace red and processed meats. So reducing red meat consumption may also benefit the environment by reducing greenhouse gases, gas emissions, deforestation, water use, and biodiversity loss. So they recommend reducing meat consumption for health and environmental reasons. So that's good to know. So the overall protein intake in the U.S. generally meets minimum requirements. So there are significant gaps in the consumption of specific recommended proteins. So people in the U.S., there isn't a problem of protein consumption. Sorry, it's a bug. I'm not a bug murderer, guys, but this gnat keeps flying around and bothering me, and I'm going to fist fight it. I'm going to figure out how to fist fight this gnat. Like, I'm trying not to, but come on now, can you get some business? Some business that's not over here. Anyways, back to the article. So while the overall... So you people in the U.S., we eat a lot of protein, probably more protein than we actually need. And so the issue isn't meeting protein requirements like you might see in some like third world countries or things like that. It's usually just about consuming the right recommended proteins that support your health better. So it says about 80% of people fall short of legume intake, and over half don't meet the recommended intake for nuts, seeds, or soy products. And then it also says 90% of the U.S. don't meet seafood intake recommendations either. So that's what they're exploring. So they tell us what their objectives are. So they have two objectives. The one is to examine the association between red and processed meat consumption and total food expenditures. And then the second one is to explore how substituting those meats with other protein sources and their effect on food expenditures. So their effect on the cost of food. And so they included 4,739 households within their analysis. So these are the red meats that they included in the study. They included beef, veal, pork, lamb, organ meats, and cured red meats. And they also assess processed meat as well. So this any meat preserved by smoking, curing, salting, or adding chemicals, including processed red meat, that's ham and bacon. And they even included poultry meat, turkey, like deli meat. And then they categorized other high protein foods such as poultry, fish, and seafood high in N3 fatty acids. Fish and N3, I'm pretty sure that's shortened for omega-3. And then fish and seafood low in N3. And then plant proteins, including nuts, peanuts, seeds, legumes, and soy. And then eggs. So that's what they were looking at. So we can kind of go down Honestly, I'm gonna be real with y'all right now. I have no idea what this graph is saying. I have no idea what this table is saying. Sometimes I know what the tables are saying, but this one, I have no idea what the table is saying. So let's scroll down. We're gonna go to the fun part, which is the results. So table 1, this is what it's saying. This is what it's saying. Table 1 shows the socio-demographic characteristics by weighted quantile of weekly red meat purchases. You tell me if that's what that's saying. Listen, I'm gonna trust them. They know what they're talking about. So the highest quantile is Q5 and the lowest is Q1. So households purchasing the highest amount of red meat, the households in Q5 had a smaller, these were the demographics of those houses. They had a smaller house size, they had a lower income, fewer children, and more adults over 60, and they were more likely to reside in the South rural areas and had higher SNAP participation. So the households, and they said they were also likely to be female, older, non-Hispanic, white, and have lower educational attainment. So the people who consumed the highest amount of meat were the highest amount of SNAP participators were female, older than 60, fewer children, smaller house size, and lower educational than the Q1 and 4. And then it says that their meat percentages acquired average it says that acquired an average of 1,314.70 grams of processed meat, whereas the lowest quantile acquired about 207.2 grams. So that's a large, between Q1 and Q2. Q1 and Q5, that's a large gap of how much red meat was consumed. So Q5 compared to Q1 to Q4, they had lower incomes of the households with processed meat. So the first one we were talking about red meat, and then the second table 2 we're talking about processed meat. And so in Q5 of people with processed meat had lower incomes, were older, more educated, predominantly female, non-Hispanic, white, and were more likely enrolled in SNAP compared with those in Q1 through 4. I think this is very interesting. And then it says, in contrast, the lowest quantile of processed meats were smaller, more likely to have an income below the 130% of the federal poverty line, and be non-Hispanic, black, and less likely to be married and non-Hispanic, white compared to households in Q2 to 5. Okay, so Q3, the 2 highest quantiles of red meat purchases were associated with higher food expenditures and lower quantile. Compared to Q3, the 2 highest quantiles of red meat purchases were associated with higher food expenditures and lower quantiles with lower food expenditures. So they compared, it looks like they compared all of the quantiles to 3 to the one in the middle, and they said that the 2 that were higher had higher expenditures than the 2 that were lower had lower food expenditures. Let's see. So on the highest red meat consuming, the highest quantile of red meat purchasing spent 16% more on food per week. And that is 51% more than households in the lowest quantile. So it was 16% more than food per week than the household on the middle, and then 51% in the lowest. So So Q5 said they spent $43 more a week on red meat than the household in the middle quantile. Then it says processed meat findings mirrored the red meat, with the highest quantiles being associated with higher total food expenditures and the lowest being associated with the lower food expenditures. It says the households on the highest quantile of processed meat purchasing spent 42% more on food per week than the households in the middle of processed meat, and then they spent 33% more on households in the lowest quantile of processed meat consumption, corresponding to an additional $36 per week. And again, you read these tables because I have no idea what they say. All right, so living in a low income household was associated with a stronger positive association between high red meat purchases and weekly food expenditures. So you realize that people in the Q5 were people who were on SNAP, and they're usually older. And I think that makes sense, honestly. I think it makes sense because people who are older, they got different recommendations, food recommendations. And so a lot of them were told that they needed to eat a lot of red meat. They were told processed meats were safe. So it makes sense that they eat that because they're like, I need my iron. I need my red meat for my iron. And, you know, processed meat, the lunch meats and things like that are just a lot of times more convenient. And so those, it makes sense that a lot of those, they're older. They tend to be older women and less children, things like that. It makes sense that they would purchase food in that way. Now when they assess red meat with, when they started the substitutions, now when they substituted red meat with an equivalent amount of seafood, it was associated with a 6% increase in total weekly food expenditures. So substituting with seafood actually increases your weekly food expenditures, which makes sense because typically if you don't live near the coast, seafood is going to be more expensive because of the process of preserving, freezing it, storing it, and shipping it will be a lot higher because they have to keep the fish fresh on the route and get it to you if you're in the middle of the United States. So it makes sense that it would be more expensive. And then they also said replacing with seafood that was high in N3, that was a 13%. So the fish that's actually supposed to be better for you because of the high N3 fatty acids is actually a 13% increase in total food. So you're increasing with seafood. And then when they replaced red meat with an equivalent amount of poultry, plant proteins, or eggs, and it looks like they grouped those all together, it says there was no significant it was not significantly associated with an increase of total food expenditures. So it looks like at that point it flatlined. And then it says for processed meat, when they assessed it against processed meat, again, N3 fatty acids, seafood high in N3 fatty acids, there was a 12% increase. And then when they substituted for poultry, plant protein, eggs, or seafood low in N3 fatty acids, there was no significant association in increased food expenditures. So basically they had two key findings, and I love this article because this one is an easy read. The other one that we read last week, that one was a difficult read. I struggled through that. I'm not gonna lie, I completely struggled through that. This one is a lot easier. So it says that key findings include higher red and processed meat consumption were both significantly associated with higher food expenditures with a dose response relationship. And then it says the association was more pronounced in households with low income, and substituting red or processed meat with seafood and high in N3 fatty acids was associated with an increase in food expenditures, whereas substitution with plant protein and eggs are cost neutral. Right? So they said that you can save up to $2,236 or $1,872 annually on the cost by substituting them with other proteins. And I thought this was very interesting because of the fact that low income households who spend a lot on red meat could actually save a lot of money if they just swapped out their proteins and consume more plant proteins. I'm going to say plant proteins because that's what we do here. But obviously, according to the article, it also includes poultry and things like that. But if you could switch out plant proteins, you could spend like $50 less on your bill each month. Imagine what you could do with $50 on your bill. So I love this article. I'm not going to go all the way through it because I pretty feel like that we got the gist of it. But again, let's talk about it. What is your food expense like? Are you a high red intake meat intake eater? Are you low? Are you consuming lots of plant-based foods? Tell me about it in the comments. Let's talk. And again, I am Alyssa Nicole. I am a plant-based lifestyle coach. That means I help you integrate healthier habits into your lifestyle. Connect with me. Shoot me a comment, like, make sure you join the family by subscribing, and I will see you on the next one. In our next one, we are going to be talking about the relationship between emotional eating and nutritional intake in adult women with overweight and obesity. I think that one's going to be a good one. Alrighty, I'll see you guys later.